Hello there, Professor Zeeb here. And what we're going to talk about next is cognitive development in early childhood. And really what we're going to focus on is, of course, the very famous Jean Piaget and his stage for early childhood, which is called the preoperational stage. So we'll get a lot more specific with that. So let's go to our slides here. Okay. So cognitive development in early childhood. I just want to give you some highlights here before we get into a specific theory, in other words, Jean Piaget. All right, so some of the cognitive advances we would expect during early childhood. Remember, this is ages approximately 3 to about 6 or so. It's going to be a rapid growth in language period. So once again, we call this the language explosion era, where children are learning language at an incredible rate. In fact, Piaget, who we're going to talk about, believed that language was a vehicle for thought. So obviously it's a big accomplishment during this time, a big cognitive accomplishment. Children are going to be using symbols. So that's another big gain during this time, the ability to use symbols, meaning symbolic thinking, understanding that this represents this. So for example, a child may sit on a mat and believe it's a magic flying carpet. In other words, it represents something bigger and more grandiose and interesting. You know, it doesn't always have to be along those lines, but the point is that the thinking is now becoming expanded to include those types of concepts where this represents something else, in other words. Increasing use of ideas and representation. So their thinking is getting more flexible. They're able to represent. What I mean by that specifically is what we call mental representation, okay? So in other words, they're able to mentally represent their world in their thinking. So for example, it could be drawing. Maybe they're drawing something that they've seen, something they've imagined in their mind, and they're able to recreate it on a piece of paper. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about, where they're starting to sort of represent their world in the form of thought and can actually picture things in their mind and that kind of thing. All right, so what we're going to cover first here, as we move beyond our highlights, is Jean Piaget's next stage, which we call the preoperational period. We're actually going to skip this particular section here. I want to move on to the more important points here, which is this next one. All right, so Piaget's preoperational period. Roughly, this is around ages 2 to 7, but it fits in with early childhood as we're covering it here. Piaget noted that children of this age, their thinking is becoming more advanced compared to, say, infancy, of course, but there are still some problems which we're going to discuss. So some of those limitations would be their thinking is not fully operational, and that's obviously why he called it the preoperational period. So once again, certainly more advanced than an infant's thoughts, but when we compare it to, say, an adult, it's just not quite there. We're going to see some shortcomings and some problems and limitations. For example, Piaget believed that early childhood type individuals cannot take two things into consideration at a time. So if there's some type of task where they have to multitask or consider two things, in the same period of time, it may trip them up and create mistakes. So Piaget noted that children often make mistakes in this sort of scenario. It's difficult for children of this age to return to the beginning of a thought sequence. In other words, to think backwards is kind of what we mean by that. So in other words, children of this age could certainly tell you how to do something in order, like tie their shoe as an example. But if we ask them, okay, how do we get from B to A, meaning the beginning of the thought sequence, it may be hard for them to kind of think backwards in that fashion. In other words, children don't have what Piaget called reversibility. It's hard to retrace their mental steps or to think in a backwards fashion. All right, so let's kind of expand on this a little bit. Now we're going to go to an example of preoperational thinking, something that potentially emerges during this time that maybe we don't see necessarily in infancy, according to Piaget. So Piaget noted during the preoperational period that children often display this cognitive skill known as animism. Okay, so animism is where they believe inanimate objects have feelings, wishes, desires, almost as if they are alive or they're a real person, just like a human would. So for example, they may, you often see this with young children where they believe their stuffed animal is actually living and has feelings and can feel pain, as an example, or they get upset. As we see this child here, monitoring their vitals, that kind of thing, almost like they really believe that these inanimate objects have real feelings and are actually almost human in that sense. For example, if I took a necklace and I wound it up and then let it go, obviously the built up energy of that would cause it to unwind, right? Obviously it's simple physics that create that change. But if we ask a child of this age, why is the necklace going backwards or why is it unwinding? They may say something like, because it wanted to. The necklace wanted to unwind, like it made that conscious decision like a person or living thing would do. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about with animism. Or if we ask a child, why did the sun chase the clouds away? They maybe say, because he's angry. Like the sun has feelings just like a person. So that's, we see that a lot with animism. It's showing that their thinking is becoming more expansive. It's sort of developing, but still it's not quite there up to par in terms of what we would expect in an adult. It's really cute and kind of funny to see kids do this, but it shows that they're not really understanding the world as it currently functions. So Piaget felt, yeah, that's obviously an advancement, but at the same time, in a way, it's like a limitation. Okay, so we mentioned mental representation. So I want to give you some examples of this and that we would see in children. And by the way, if you have access to kids at this age, like your own kids or relatives, that kind of thing, be looking for this because you can actually see this in action. So Piaget believed that mental representation is a great cognitive accomplishment of this period. It's how we record and express information. And in a way, you could argue it's serving the basis or the foundation for abstract thought, which Piaget really believed does not happen until adolescence, but it's kind of like the glimmer of that, the beginnings of thinking in a more advanced way. So certainly it's an advancement in that sense. All right, so let's look at some examples of that. And like I said, I want you to think of children in your own life where possibly you could see this as well. First one is called deferred imitation. What this basically means is the child is imitating behavior after the disappearance of a model. So they've deferred the imitation until after the model has disappeared or the person or thing they were watching is what I mean by that. For example, let's say that you go to the zoo and you spend the whole day looking at the animals with your children. And then at the end of the day, as you're walking to your car through the parking lot, you may notice that your child is starting to act like one of the monkeys that they saw earlier in the day. That is very similar to deferred imitation. In other words, not only did they see the behavior of the monkey, they had to remember it and picture it in their mind and then recreate it in their own behavior. So that's, from a cognitive standpoint, that's fascinating. That shows an advancement, that they're able to represent something that they've seen and then totally recreate it in their own behavior. So Piaget felt that was a huge advancement of this time where children are able to do that. Symbolic play is going to be a huge example of this one. So symbolic play meaning the pretend play or make-believe play that preschool children are famous for. I don't know if I told you guys this, but before I became a professor, I actually used to work as a substitute teacher. And sometimes I would teach kindergarten. So kids are about 5 or so. And we would have recess duty. So, occasionally we would have to go out on the playground and monitor behavior so kids aren't hurting themselves and that kind of thing. And I remember one of the things that they love to do is play something called Monster, where one child would be the monster and the other children would be the victims and they would run away. So that, in a way, that's a form of a symbolic play because they're recreating a whole different scenario. maybe they've seen this like in a movie or a book or something, and so they're thinking about it and they're sort of recreating it in their own behavior. Another example is where if a child picks up a stick and they imagine, wow, this is my lightsaber, and they sort of play like they're a Jedi Knight or something, for my Star Wars fans out there. You get the point. So when children do this sort of make-believe play and pretend play, to a lot of people it seems like, wow, it's just ordinary having fun type experiences. But from a developmental cognitive perspective, it's like, wow, you know, they're really expanding their thinking by doing that. Another example would be drawing. So of course, kids of this age love to draw and color and things like that. And it's not necessarily that they're just having fun, and of course they are. But you could also argue that when children draw things in their artwork, it's mentally representing their world. In fact, children often draw their own house, or they draw themselves, or things that they've seen before, like daddy's car, as an example. So that drawing, of course, is having fun and playing, but at the same time, it may reflect what they're thinking and what they're feeling and what they've experienced. In a sense, it's almost like a window into their mind to kind of understand what's happening. In fact, there's a very famous psychological test called the house person tree, where we ask them to draw those three things, and supposedly it represents what they're sort of experiencing, what they're feeling in their own life. That's a way to ask them those types of questions. Okay, so once again, it's just another example of symbolic thinking, very highly symbolic, where they're able to mentally represent the world in the form of a drawing or artwork. So this will conclude our short lecture here on Piaget's pre-operational stage, and please progress on to the next step in the class.